Hi everybody, a short message from my kitchen table. What you're about to see is my conversation with Adar Weinreb, who ran an investigation on the death of the Bibas family, of the mother and the two children, that is Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir, which the Israelis claim, at least for the children, that they were strangled to death. What Adar found is that there is a very high probability that these children, as many other hostages, were killed under Israeli bombing by direct trauma or by collapsing structures. Because the Bibas were an icon of Israeli victimhood and were an icon of what Israel very often presents as Jewish suffering, they serve the purpose of rallying support for the slaughter of Gaza. I tend to think that this kind of information, digging it, finding it, and putting it to the light to confront the official narrative are basically the main task of journalism. That, as a matter of fact, journalism is my own extracurricular education. And I do this because I think it is essential if democracy will survive at all. As we're seeing media and politics across the board in which truth is in deep crisis, I think that digging this information and working at establishing what the facts were remains essential. And it's not just a political imperative, I think it's really also a moral imperative. With all this, I want to say that I am looking for your support, that to do this, quite a bit of money and quite a bit of time goes into it, including paying for tools that I use to produce and, of course, putting bread on the table. So if you like my content, if you like my interviews, my articles, and the things that I do, and if you would like to support it, I would be extremely honored to have you on board. My hope is never to have to charge for the content, because I think that you cannot sell truth when everybody else is giving away lies and prevarication. So I tend to think that this is also public service. So that goes to say that any little bit that you can actually contribute will not only be greatly appreciated, but would also make a huge difference in terms of keeping Inconclusive Thoughts, which also is run in German and in Spanish and has now a fairly broad social media presence, including 80,000 followers in Instagram. It will help to keep it alive. Okay, so thank you very much. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Adar Weinreb.
All right. So, Adar, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Adar Weinreb. I am an Israeli-American entrepreneur and advocate for peace. I'll focus on my peace advocacy because I think that's probably more relevant. I served in the IDF from 2008 until 2011. In around 2014, during the Gaza war, the 2014 Gaza war, is when I started to have a shift in how I saw things. I was never raised to hate Palestinians. I just thought, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. We need to defend ourselves against them. But in the years after getting released from the IDF, I started understanding that it's not so simple as good guys versus bad guys. And I started understanding that they have a lot of legitimacy to their narrative. And I started recognizing if I was in their shoes, I would see the world as they do. And I would hate Israel if I was Palestinian. I'm like, wait, so does the side of the border we're born on really decide how we view the world and who we support and who we hate? Like, I over time came to that realization. And then in the 2014 Gaza war, I saw two distinct narratives online: Israel under attack, Gaza under attack. Nobody was saying the people of Israel and Palestine under attack. Nobody was trying to humanize both sides. So I started just writing Facebook posts, trying to humanize both sides. And a lot of people really appreciated them, but a lot of people also hated them. I maybe not hated them, but didn't like them. And I, over time, understood why. When you humanize somebody's enemy, you become the enemy. But I stuck to doing this on and off. It was never my main focus because I built some companies throughout the years. But on my free time, I've always been involved in peace activism. In 2021, in 2020, during COVID, I launched a YouTube channel where I started doing live stream conversations between both sides, which I still do until today. And then after October 7th, I picked it up a little notch and started being more active just because I felt like there was just a great need for voices of peace, especially when both our populations are more radical than ever before and the world is becoming more polarized. I started dedicating more time to just trying to be a voice of moderation and of unity and of reconciliation in a sea of extremism, fear, and hate.
All right. So you became quite prominent, I suppose, over since January of this year or thereabout, February perhaps, where you actually posted an analysis, a forensic analysis on the Bibas. Before we get to what you actually wrote and what your conclusions and what was your method, can you tell me a bit, especially being inside Israel, what has been the function of the Bibas? Why have the Bibas family, Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir been so important in the Israeli narrative?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, I wasn't in Israel when I put out that analysis, but we saw how what they symbolized. It was these children, these young children who were taken hostage alongside their mother, which is something that should never be done. And there were some children that were released in the first hostage deal, which I believe was 40 days after October 7th, but they were still there. And so they just became the symbol of the brutality of October 7th and the brutality of Hamas, focusing on the fact that they took these two very young children. So I think we were all people were waiting to get them back. The country was just anticipating the return. We did get information early on, a few months after October 7th, that they were killed in an airstrike. It wasn't widely reported on in the media. People didn't necessarily believe Hamas's word for it, and I understand why.
Just to make clear, this was actually what Hamas released as information, saying that they had been killed by the Israelis in a bombing, but the source was Hamas. There was no confirmation, and obviously anything that Hamas said in the general context of the discussion was essentially more or less dismissed, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a good rule of thumb. There's both Israel and Hamas have an incentive to lie and a long history of doing so. So I do understand why people didn't want to accept that as truth. I will say, though, Hamas doesn't really I'm not sure what the incentive is to lie about that specifically. So when I heard that report, I took it to be true even then. Obviously, that's not enough. We do need confirmation, but it wasn't clear why they would just make that up, right? So there's certain things that there's an incentive to lie about and other things that there aren't. So even parties that are not honest, if they say something that there's no incentive to fabricate or lie, then I think we should have a higher degree of trust for such information. So I assumed that they were telling the truth because I couldn't see what they would benefit from making that up.
Matter of fact, so just to put it into context, these were probably two of the highest assets for a negotiation that Hamas was holding, right? Because they were very, very visible. They were very important, not only in terms of Israel, but around the world. The Bibas became sort of the very expression of the brutality of Hamas. And as a matter of fact, them being killed deprived Hamas of the possibility of using them as negotiating chips. What I wanted to point out is that also during the period, the father, Yarden, was still was still held by Hamas. There was no report on him at that point, I believe, but it was quite clear that they were separated, or it seemed that they were separated, because in fact, I think the capture had been of the two family parts separated, right?
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's all. Let you carry on.
And you make a good point that the moment they announced they were dead, and we did see this in the subsequent negotiations, they weren't able to negotiate bringing them back alive. They even, part of their negotiation was saying we will return their bodies, right? So they were consistent with this claim that they had been killed. One can say, maybe they said they were killed in order to put pressure on Israel because of their airstrikes. They wanted to blame Israel. You could speculate on that, but the way the story was told, the way it was used in negotiation, it was assumed, in my opinion, it should have been assumed to be true. Now, the cause of death is something we can continue to speculate on, and I know we will get into that.
Okay, so sorry. So at some point or other, there are a bunch of ceasefire negotiations, and according at least to hostage families that met with Netanyahu around the 9th or 11th of 9 or 10th of October of 2023, there had been offers on the table for the release of all civilians. That's one story. And then there was, in early November, mid-November, a ceasefire offer of everybody against everybody, or everybody for everybody, which Israel sort of dismissed, but presumably they also rejected. Was there any information about this? I mean, I assume it was not broadly known, right, in Israel.
Broadly known, sorry, I meant the ceasefire. The ceasefire.
Right. The ceasefire offers of October and of November, that some of them were quite sort of broad and all-encompassing.
Right. So the first word we ever got of a ceasefire deal was not through the actual ceasefire negotiations. It was actually Sinwar put out a statement saying we will release all hostages for all prisoners, all Palestinian prisoners, and you won't enter Gaza. That was the deal. And, you could see why this wouldn't be a favorable deal for Israel, but generally you come with an offer and then you negotiate and meet in the middle. Right. So the first offer is very rarely what is eventually agreed upon. So it's important to keep that in mind, because people say, why would we ever agree to that? Well, you should negotiate and try to reach an agreement. So that was the first publicly available deal.
If I can interrupt you, also, I think that there is a question about the priority that, at least in speech, the hostages represented. And then there is obviously the question of having kids like the Bibas kids and the mother being captured. So, I mean, in a sense, I don't know, I mean, speaking as a father, I would say there is really just about nothing I wouldn't do to have my children and my family released of that situation, when like the family of the hostages becomes sort of the model of the Israeli family, under pressure, under suffering, and under the excruciating pain of having their family members. It seems very strange that this had been sort of cavalierly dismissed, and then sort of the march on to attacks to war was on.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason, there's certain things that Hamas would not compromise on. For example, if Israel would have then continued the war, Hamas wouldn't compromise on that. If it required Hamas to step down from power, they wouldn't have compromised on that. But they would have compromised perhaps on the number of prisoners, right? And the reason I say it's not a deal Israel's likely to agree to is because they wanted to get the release of even those who were involved in October 7th. But if you get an offer, you try to reach common ground. And there's ways to pressure Hamas militarily while trying to get this initial offer and getting them all home. I always think we should exhaust all nonviolent means before engaging in actions that are sure to enact a massive cost on civilian life. And this was my position from October 7th. The cost.
Sorry, what to me is very curious is that your words would carry special weight if you think that your family is being held at gunpoint somewhere, right? I mean, you would do anything possible before detonating a situation of extreme violence.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now, the way Israelis look at it, they say, well, if we just negotiate and return prisoners, then it'll just happen again. So if we need to sacrifice our own now to protect more in the future, that's worth it. So that would be the counter argument. But I think to ensure death and destruction, and then it's like if we take the path of death and destruction, which is just massive aerial bombardments, we know that we're going to lose our own and many of their civilians. If we do a hostage release, we're speculating what might happen in the future. But depending on what happens after the hostage release is actually what's going to determine if there will be another attack. The surest way to prevent another October 7th is long-term peace, which we have not tried to negotiate with Hamas. And I know this is seen as a radical position in Israeli society, but there's been many violent resistance groups that have had maximalist positions that have been negotiated into moderation and made massive concessions on their demands. We've never attempted that. And the second best way to prevent another attack is just learning from our failures of October 7th. So to me, it does make sense to support a path that ensures death and destruction, only to maybe mitigate harm in the future.
Can I ask you something concerning what you just said? I know that this might not be something you know, but at least your sense, how broad is the acceptance for the idea that hostages are worth sacrificing for not, for preventing another iteration of this kind of violence?
I think it depends when you ask the Israeli public. After October 7th, there was so much trauma and pain, and Israelis just overwhelmingly were in the position we need to defeat Hamas by any means necessary. Now 2 years have passed, and not only have we had some time to heal from the pain, but we also understand that we're unlikely to defeat them militarily. So the majority of Israelis today support getting them all back, even if it requires keeping Hamas in power. But it really depends when you would ask the population, right? Just this past week, we had the number the government put it at was millions of protesters protesting to end the war and get the hostages back. It's like 30% of the Israeli population protesting. I don't know if there's been any example of that throughout history of 30% of a country engaging in a protest. So there's an overwhelming demand right now that we need to end this. We need to get them home.
So the Bibas are dead, and now the confirmation comes with the release of the bodies. And that was sort of presented by Israeli media as a bit of a circus and a bit of a parade. But by some standards, one would imagine that a military escort for the coffins was meant to show at least some sort of dignified treatment of bodies, or dignified treatment of the mortal remains of the family. It really was, however, used as an expression of in the Israeli narrative, an expression of farther and darker Hamas cruelty.
Mm-hmm. We often have a tendency to attribute evil to all the actions of our enemies, when often there's a much better and different explanation. So a lot of the parades they were doing and what they did for the bodies, I agree with your interpretation. It was just to probably for their own internal PR to show that they're victorious doing all these parades. But it was also, there was something they were trying to show respect for the hostages, bringing them on stage, respect for those who died. Like, that's what I think they were trying to present outward. It just did. I don't think it was calculated well, because not only was the Israeli public furious about it, I don't think it landed well in the international community. So I think it was a miscalculation on their part, but I don't think their intention for doing it was, let's just try to be as mean as possible. I think that's just an assumption that, people generally have about their enemy.
It did set the ground for what came immediately after, which brings us to what is meant to be the main topic of our conversation, which was the statements that came out of putative forensic studies of the bodies. Well, there was a mix-up first, right? I mean, one of the first things that happened was that Shiri was apparently confused for another body, or another body was presented for the body of Shiri Bibas. How did that happen? Do you have any idea of what were the circumstances of that?
Yeah, so I put out, and we'll get into it, an analysis that the most likely cause of death by far was an airstrike. And the fact that they sent the wrong body actually supports this hypothesis, because if the Bibas family were recovered from under rubble, you could see how they would confuse her body with the body of somebody else who was killed in that airstrike. The kids would not be hard to identify. They have bright red hair, they're children, but a woman with darker hair who's buried under rubble, you could see why they would take the wrong body. Now, this is another example where people said, oh, you see, they're playing psychological warfare, they sent the wrong body. That's not, in my opinion, a plausible explanation. Palestinians have a great sensitivity to us keeping bodies of their dead. For religious purposes, they want to be able to bury them in the Islamic way. For them to send us one of their dead for us to then keep just for psychological warfare, that doesn't seem plausible. The fact that they sent the wrong body only further supports the airstrike hypothesis, in my opinion.
So now the piece of information that gets more or less leaked first, and then it has some sort of confirmation, but not really confirmation, is a monstrous story, really, which I think echoes in some way the sort of 40 decapitated babies and the sort of children hanging from drying lines and children in ovens, which is that the two children were strangled to death, and I think the mother was as well, or something like that. But really just an image of pure evil, which obviously helps, both in Israel and most certainly in places like Germany and so on, to emphasize the monstrosity of Hamas, but also to build a lot of public support for just continuing the slaughter of Gaza. So what was your reaction when you heard about this?
So I already had a strong sense that Israel would do that. So the reason I was able to release an analysis the day after is because it was already partially prepared, because Israel's behavior was expected. The reason I decided to do it was after October 7th, I saw how much atrocity propaganda there is, how the average Israeli and the average supporter of Israel doesn't have a good understanding of what happened on October 7th. October 7th was a brutal massacre. But if you hear a lot of the stories people still tell about, again, the number of children that were killed, that babies were targeted, beheaded babies, babies in ovens, babies on clothesline, baby cut out of a mother's stomach, families lit on fire and burnt alive. These are all things that when you actually look at the evidence, we now know that this didn't happen. And the babies being targeted is the easiest to know because we have the names and ages of everybody killed. So we could see that there was one baby killed and one toddler killed. And when you look at their cause of death, it seems like they were caught in the crossfire and not executed, right? But most Israelis still till today don't know this. And this pained me. Also, a lot of the stories around sexual violence were also not based on evidence. They were just based on speculation. It was just, they took something horrific, but just amplified it by orders of magnitude for PR purposes. And I took this personally because I saw how they're taking a very traumatic event for my family and making it more traumatic only to convince the world that Hamas is bad. And they want to convince the world Hamas is bad to manufacture consent in order to engage in a war that is killing overwhelmingly civilians. So I saw this as a very, very problematic form of propaganda. And again, I want to make it clear, October 7th was horrific, but the stories that are imprinted in our memory for the most part, are not stories that are not things that actually happened. So it was successful. So an analogy I used, if October 7th was like, imagine a knife to the stomach, Israel, instead of removing the knife and helping us heal, twisted the knife in order to blame that on Hamas brutality. So I took that personally. I saw how it affected my own family members, my own mother. And I promised myself, if I see them do something like this again, I'm going to do something about it. And then when I saw that Bibas is getting released, I had already seen reports that the IDF was targeting the homes of hostage takers, even if there was intel that the hostages might be there. And it was clear that the likeliest cause of death in captivity, in captivity in Gaza, is going to be an airstrike. And I also knew that there's not a strong historical precedent for intentionally killing children. Not Islamists don't do it, criminals don't do it. It's very rare to intentionally kill a young child.
Can I ask you something, just on something you said? Can you talk a bit more about when did you first started to hear about the IDF targeting hostage taker homes, even if the hostages were there? What was the context of that information?
Well, first I was aware that Israel admitted to killing some hostages, and also some hostages got released and said that they were almost killed. So I already suspected that this was a likely cause of death. And this was a few months before Bibas was released. I already assumed that that was the most likely cause of death. And then a few weeks before Bibas was released, there was a report released by 972, which is an Israeli publication, that relied on 11 whistleblowers from Israeli intelligence units describing a deliberate policy to kill Hamas militants either in tunnels or in their homes. And the whistleblowers explicitly said, we knew that we very well may be killing hostages, and we were still doing it. It was controversial, but we were doing it. They also said if we knew for certain that there's hostages there, then we wouldn't have done it. But often the intelligence is murky, and if we didn't know for sure, we would just take the shot. So once I saw that, it became very clear, and it just confirmed in my mind what the Bibas cause of death. And I found it hard to believe that Israel would come out and admit it. What we did see is a lot of the bodies that came back dead, they never really explained how they died. They just said died in captivity, killed by Hamas. They didn't get into details, but I knew this would be different because the world and the Israeli public were waiting to hear what happened to them. It's not something that Israel could just, you say, dead in captivity. It's something we would want to know. So I had a strong sense that they would come up with a story that was not true.
Okay, so moving forward, you see the story about the strangling of the Bibbas children, and it took you really a very, very short time to put together the analysis and do the forensic run. So can you walk us a little bit through what was your method? How did you approach this?
Yeah, sure. So what I put out is what I would consider to be a probabilistic analysis. There's no way to know for sure. It relies on a collection of circumstantial evidence. Our options are either believe Israel blindly, believe Hamas blindly, or look at the available evidence and do a probabilistic analysis. So that's what my analysis was. And it looked at a few primary things. One is the forensics department and how they function. And the forensics department, and this is a small error I made in my analysis, which I corrected the following day, but the forensics department doesn't have any history of putting out fake forensics reports. What they do, what we found some signs of, is them obfuscating and just omitting details when convenient, not in an official report, but when they're talking to the media. So we do see them have some flexibility in how they describe things if it serves the Israeli narrative. So I demonstrated some examples of them doing that. I then went over all the evidence we have of Israel killing hostages in airstrikes. These were from the hostages Israel admitted to killing. These were the hostages that were almost killed, and they told us this when they got released. And it's from other hostages who said the thing they feared most in captivity was being killed in airstrikes because they were constantly close to airstrikes. And then I also went through just the Hamas's history of targeting children, and they don't really have, and this is not just Hamas, it's other Islamist groups, it's just other violent resistance groups, it's other militaries. The deliberate killing of babies is very rare. And I went into the numbers of October 7th, that 1 baby and 1 toddler were killed. And if we look at all children 12 and under, there's only 12, right? So 1,200 people were killed, 1%. 1% were 12 and under. So they're very underrepresented for their share of the population. And when we look at how those 12 were killed, we see that they were all caught in the crossfire and not executed. And when you even hear how Hamas describes themselves, they consider themselves these Islamic holy warriors who, and generally Islamic teaching says children, and I'm not talking about children under 18 because they would view a teenager as an adult. So I do think they intentionally kill teenagers, but children under 12, they view as holy and pure. And there's this notion that when you're that age, you are by default Muslim. And this was very much represented in the data of those killed. We also have a video from October 7th of Hamas shooting a father standing next to his son. They just left the son there. Now, not to minimize that, that's horrific having your father murdered in front of your eyes, but I'm just trying to review the available data and see what their likelihood is of intentionally killing young children. And we don't have historical precedent for it. And it wasn't Hamas holding these children, it was a different Islamic group, but if they were strangled to death, it would be the first time in 100 years of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that a baby was strangled to death. It's possible that's what happened, but when you look at the evidence we have for airstrikes killing people, which is overwhelming, and you look at the evidence we have for strangulation or deliberate targeting of babies, there's not much at all. So based on that alone, you could do a probabilistic analysis of what is by far the most likely. Now, if Israel was telling the truth, it would be very easy to prove this. So first of all, the way they described it was also suspicious. They never said, our forensics department confirmed that they were strangled to death. That's not what they said. They said, based on intelligence reports and from the forensics verification process, we have confirmed that they have been killed with their bare hands. Almost every time they mentioned, they said intelligence assessment. Why do they feel the need to rely so heavily on intelligence? Because it allows them to fill in the gaps. Forensics could have came with a vague claim saying they died from blunt force. Blunt force could be a building collapsing on you, but then Israel can then not blame it. The way they bring up intelligence, because then they're not saying forensics explicitly told us this. The only thing we heard from forensics did not confirm Israel's story. The lead in forensics pathologist, Chen Kugel, came out and said, there's no sign of injury from bombing, which again, that counts for something, but because we know that forensics departments sometimes, if there's gray area, we've seen them in this gray area kind of leave things up for interpretation. Does bombing mean there's no, like a building collapse is not a bombing, it's a building collapse, but that's a cause of an airstrike, right? So that's all we heard from forensics. No injuries from bombing. Forensics never said how they were killed. But
so mainly, no injuries for bombing could also mean no, basically open, exposed wounds consistent with shrapnel.
Exactly. And that's all they said. And then we heard Israeli spokesperson Daniel Hagari say they did horrific things to the body to try to make it seem like it was. So it sounds like they're describing blunt force trauma from a building collapsing, right? Or it could also be suffocation from a building collapsing. So forensics never came out and confirmed their cause of death publicly. That's all we heard from them. It was
to summarize. So we have a forensic, we have the 2 dead children, and now we have a forensic department that does not confirm collapse, but doesn't confirm shrapnel. But then we have a spokesperson for the government already saying that, as a matter of fact, there is something that seems to look like blunt force of some sort. When he says they did awful things to the
Yeah,
body, sounds like an admission that there is something that looks like blunt force.
exactly. And also, the Daniel Hagari, Israeli spokesperson, made this claim hours after they got released, before you had time for a full autopsy. And so the only two people who made this claim about their cause of death was Netanyahu at an AIPAC meeting, and Daniel Hagari. We never heard it from forensics. But if what they're saying is true, it's very easy to confirm it. There's hundreds of independent forensics departments throughout the world that you could send the autopsy to. There's dozens of human rights organizations that you can confirm this with. It's very low-hanging fruit to prove to the world the brutality of Hamas.
Now, let me ask you something. I mean, these documents, the forensic analysis, the pathologist analysis, is somewhere, right? These things are sitting somewhere, presumably.
Yeah.
Is your sense that one day we will see these things, or do you think that these are things that probably we will?
I don't know. I don't have high confidence that we'll see it. I think there's probably only a small handful of people who know the truth on this. And I'm also not really a conspiracy theorist. I think a lot of most conspiracies people believe are true aren't. For conspiracy to be probable, only a small group of people need to know about it, because then you're likely to get a leak. Not a lot of people will buy in. But I think this is something that maybe 5 people know, and this would be people at the forensics department and maybe some higher ups in government who made the decision to not be honest about it.
The reason why I ask is, I mean, of course, you have the question of conspiracy, but I mean, I think that what I have in mind is something much closer to Zaka, putting out the story of the 40 decapitated babies, or the baby that was burnt in an oven, and then you have Landau presenting to Matt Fry in Channel 4. I mean, this sort of funny picture, and Matt Fry, I think it was Matt Fry, who says, like, look, there is nothing here that looks. So, it's not quite a conspiracy. I mean, I think I see it more as a sort of a way of hiding.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, I agree with you completely. And interestingly, another thing, Israel said we are going to send this report to our allies in the West for them to confirm it. And that actually does not account for much, because to get like US intelligence and British intelligence to confirm an intelligence report by Israel, that should also be taken with a grain of salt. But interestingly, we didn't even get that. So they said we're sending it to our allies in the West. US intelligence, we did not hear an official confirmation from an Israeli ally. But the best evidence is just forensics departments around the world that could very easily confirm this. It's very easy for Israel to do. Israel did none of that. So when I put out the analysis the day after we got the news, I would say I was probably 80 to 85% sure that in what I was saying. And I knew I was taking a risk. A lot of people got angry with me, but I felt confident enough in my claims to put out the analysis. Now that months have passed and Israel stopped talking about it in an official capacity, they don't make the claim anymore. They never proved it. I'm over 90% certain that this is what happened.
So what happened, according to you, is that they died as a result of a bombing.
Yeah, and an airstrike. Yeah.
Do you have?
If it was strangulation, Israel would prove it. It's very easy to confirm. So the lack of confirmation, in my opinion, tells us everything we need to know.
Do you have from the top of your head a sense of how many hostages do you think that have actually died as the effect of bombing?
So Israel has admitted to 12. I believe the number is 12 Israel's admitted to dying in airstrikes, but we have had another dozen or two, 1 to 2 dozen hostages released that came back dead, and Israel never explained their cause of death. Some we know were executed when the IDF was moving in on their position, but most of them, they never gave their cause of death. Even Shiri Bibas, they never told us the cause of death, which is interesting. They were strangled, they said, but they didn't tell us how Shiri Bibas was killed. But Israel admitted to 12. The 12 they admitted to were all bodies that were uncovered by soldiers on the ground, which causes Israel to lose plausible deniability, because you have a whole squad that has some information on how they were killed and the state of the body. We know that a fair bit died from carbon monoxide poisoning in the tunnels. So when Israel uses a bunker buster to blow up a tunnel, it releases carbon monoxide as a byproduct. So you can imagine a situation where soldiers find bodies in a tunnel with no injuries. That's much harder to keep a secret, right? Because it's not just forensics, keeping quiet, it's a unit found them. So in the instances where Israel lost plausible deniability, they admitted how they were killed. In the instances where they could maintain plausible deniability, they just said killed in captivity. So I think we could assume that the number is a fair bit higher than 12, but we can't know for sure. I think it's likely over 20 hostages have been killed in airstrikes.
More than Israel has actually managed to release through force.
Correct. We've released seven through force, 100 through negotiation, and killed dozens, very well 2 dozen or more through through airstrikes.
Do you have the feeling that, I mean, I understand that you're reading, and along with a lot of the information that is coming out of Gaza is not widely shared in Israel, among other things, because of military censorship, but also because there is probably a lack of will, I imagine, among the public to accept this kind of facts or this kind of analysis. But I wonder if there is not also some degree of exhaustion on the empty promises of release of hostages. At the same time, if there is not a sense of betrayal when you hear people like Smotrich or people like, people coming out of Netanyahu's office itself saying that the hostages are not a priority. I ask this because the sense that I get, and perhaps this in some way back to the original question, is that the hostages had become everybody's family in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're a tight-knit community, and to have millions of people protesting for people they've never met for their release, there's something beautiful and inspiring about it. And yeah, that's one of the reasons why there is an exhaustion. There's a lack of faith in the leadership. People don't think Hamas will be defeated. So why are we still sending our own to be killed, to be traumatized? Why are we continuing to kill our hostages rather than bring them back? And why are we continuing to kill civilians? There is also a growing movement in the protest movement that's focusing on the death toll in Gaza, right? It's not all about hostages. There's a growing movement of saying, stop killing Palestinian children, and that's new. And that's also good to see. It's very hard to convince a deeply traumatized and radicalized population to care about their enemy. But we're starting to see, like, the population of their enemy, right? But we're starting to see more of that here in the protest movement as well. Yeah.
Are you optimistic not only about the conflict but the slaughter of Gaza, but are you confident about justice, I suppose, in the Israeli context? Even for the hostages, I'm not talking about like as victims of Hamas, but I'm talking about, byproducts or secondary collateral damage of the Israeli operations, both the day, the 7th of October, and, in the aftermath.
Yeah, so I wanted to make one more point that I forgot to mention. When I talk to Israelis about Bibas' cause of death, and I don't bring it up often, it's just not the most important or interesting topic, but on the few occasions where I've spoken to Israelis about it, they're actually very easily convinced that the government's lying about it, believe it or not. Israelis are not trusting of their government. Yeah, we band together in time of war. Yeah, we revere the IDF. It's the most revered institution in Israeli society by far. But when I explain to Israelis the logic behind the analysis I put out, they're pretty easily convinced, at least from the few people I spoke to about it. In terms of my hopes for justice, if there's justice, Netanyahu should sit in a jail cell. Ben-Gvir should sit in a jail cell for torturing prisoners. Some generals and soldiers should be charged with war crimes without a doubt. I don't know if there's a high likelihood of that happening because the U.S. is actively protecting and now sanctioning the ICC for them trying to hold Israel accountable. So I don't know, I don't have a high degree of confidence, but yes, I would like to see there be accountability for what we're seeing. It's I think that's something important for us to be living in for us to make moral progress, that if you commit so many war crimes and you enact such death and destruction on a population, that you don't get away with it. But I don't know how confident I am that that will happen.
Adar, thank you very, very much. You've been really very kind with your time. It was really just fascinating, quite honestly fascinating, disturbing, of course. And yeah, if at any point you want to come by, you're of course always welcome.
Sure. Yeah, Martin, this was great. I really appreciate you bringing me on. You know, we did talk about a heavy topic, and you know, I'm doing what I'm doing because I want to see a beautiful and just solution to this conflict that's taken all too many lives. We've been fighting for 100 years. Right now, our security comes at the expense of another population's liberty, and it's not a situation, it's just not an acceptable situation. So I'll keep fighting the good fight until, from the river to the sea, all the people are free. And I believe we can achieve that.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Martin.
Take care.